In the previous video, titled, Why Did Reverend Moon State the Clerics Are Worse Than Lucifer? We saw that Reverend Sun Myung Moon judged and condemned the Unification Church leaders, referred to as clerics, for their role in derailing God's providence and destroying Reverend Moon's own family in the process. The clerics advocated for and benefited from a church institution that they created and controlled as intermediaries. Reverend Moon called them worse than Lucifer for their devious acts. We also saw that in the final years of his life, Reverend Moon said that he has no wife and that there is no one in the position of true mother.
어머님을 내가 길러와서요. 어머니 없습니다. 문 총재 아내의 자리도 없어요. 제멋대로야, 제멋대로.
A schism was unleashed upon the unification movement in the final years of Reverend Moon's life by a cabal of clerics working with Reverend Moon's wife, Mrs. Hak Ja-han, and certain members of Reverend Moon's family, as they united against Reverend Moon's long-recognized heir. Over the last 14 years, the schism has led to mass confusion within and without the movement. Such confusion over the leadership and theology of the movement is without precedent in its long history. Key concepts and theological notions that were once sacred and immutable have come under attack. That is why, now, more than ever, it is crucial for movement members to go back to Reverend Moon's original teachings and re-evaluate the trajectory on which the movement and their spiritual lives are headed. This is of utmost importance, since Unification Church clerics are deceivingly promoting a new and unprincipled, only begotten daughter, or OBD theology, as a new revelation from God. However, in this video we will see why Reverend Moon said that there is no one in the position of true mother, and we will see how OBD is a radical feminist reaction, born out of resentment to, and a denial of Adamic authority. We will also see that OBD repeats the sins of Eve in the process of the fall, as explained by the divine principle. To understand how OBD theology is a rejection of the principle and to understand the significance of the schism, one has to understand the original teachings of Reverend Moon. In the divine principle, Reverend Moon teaches that God bestowed 3 blessings upon Adam and Eve. Blessings that represented God's hope and love for them. They were meant to reach physical and spiritual maturity, create a God-centered family, and take stewardship of the created universe. Adam and Eve were to establish the 4-position foundation centered on God, as they united in marriage under God's love and blessing. Their children were to be raised in this loving environment, establishing a lineage and a world that reflected God's truth, righteousness and goodness, and His true love. However, this ideal never came to be realized. As the divine principle teaches, this is because the first human ancestors failed to absolutely unite with God. Eve's reversal of dominion over Adam, centered upon Satan, was the pivotal part in the human fall. The fall prevented humanity from realizing the 3 blessings, and led to a world marred by sin and separation from God. From a principled viewpoint, Reverend Moon made a clear distinction between true love and false love. He taught that true love is not chaotic, but an ordered love, centering upon God's original purpose of creation. Specifically, he taught that the 4 realms of heart unfold in an orderly way, that is, there is order in the vertical love between God and His children, Adam and Eve, who should have stood as perfected son and daughter. And there is order in the horizontal relationship between husband and wife. When that couple has children, there is also an order in the love between parents and their children, as well as that between siblings. A distinguishing aspect of Reverend Moon's teaching is that it focuses on bringing humanity back to God's original purpose before the fall. The reason Eve's reversal of dominion is so significant is because it violated God's intended order of love from the very beginning. It severed the vertical relationship with God, instead centering it on Satan. It also violated the order of love, in the relationship between men and women, in Adam and Eve, as well as between siblings in the following generation of Cain and Abel. Then, what is the Messianic mission? The Adamic figure, or Messianic figure, comes as a man, who has to create an ideal family, and has to restore the failures of the original Adam's family that took place over those 2 generations. He and his wife must set the proper precedent of gender roles within their relationship, centered upon God. As mentioned previously, Reverend Moon taught that the Messiah, who comes to bring humanity back to God, and restore the order of love, is an Adamic figure. Therefore, the Messiah is a man, without original sin, who has no connection to the fall. That is his basic identity. Throughout his life, Reverend Moon consistently taught the context and notion of God's original ideal, the process of the human fall, and the path to restoration by the Messianic figure. But, going directly against the basic identity of the Messianic figure, Mrs. Han claims herself to be the only begotten daughter, saying that the Messianic figure is a woman. Mrs. Han said,
God sent the only begotten daughter to be born within the environment of Christianity, for the first time in 6,000 years.
This is an affront to God, and to his principle. Nowhere in the divine principle, nor in any of Reverend Moon's teachings does the Messianic figure come as a woman. Reverend Moon addresses this issue in the Divine Principle Black Book and in other teachings when he says, should the Messiah come as a man, or as a woman? Since creation began with Adam, the Lord who comes at the end, will come with the qualification of an unblemished, perfected Adam. He further stated, the center of all religions, is one specific person, he is the Messiah. The Messiah, is a man. Centering on this triumphant man, there should be victory on the level of the family, tribe, and people, and a foundation for national victory must be laid. In light of Reverend Moon's teaching, Mrs. Han's words are an attempt to take over the position of central figure of the providence, denying and rejecting the Adamic figure, thereby repeating Eve's reversal of dominion. The very term, only begotten daughter, is an adoption of the Christian term, only begotten son, which refers to the second Adamic figure, Jesus. Mrs. Han copies an essential Christian belief that embodies the concept of unique sonship, or daughtership in her case, that underscores a special and singular relationship with God. The Christian term not only indicates a special relationship, but also embodies a belief of the actual divinity of Jesus. By saying that she is only begotten, Mrs. Han is claiming a distinction from other human beings, trying to claim her own divinity. Mrs. Han's claim of female messiahship has no precedent in the Bible, since various titles and roles ascribed to the messianic figure are traditionally masculine. Prophecies in the Old Testament consistently referred to the Messiah as a man. And in Jewish tradition, men are heads of the household. The Jewish conception of the Messiah is primarily that of a king-like figure who comes from the Davidic line. Adam, the primordial Adamic figure, was a man, and the person who was sent by God to restore the error of the fall, Jesus, was also a man. Jesus' public life and ministry took place within a role that was associated with men. Further, Jesus used the term, Son of Man, that carried Adamic connotations, and his genealogy, traced through male ancestors. But, Mrs. Han's claims are rooted in modern feminism thought, which flat out rejects the traditional family order that exists in Abrahamic faith traditions. It was Unification Church clerics and theologians, who adopted radical feminist ideas to promote the only begotten daughter, introducing these notions to Mrs. Han. As reflected in radical feminism, they seek to deny the necessity and importance of the father figure, and of all men in general. In contrast, according to the divine principle, in the process of restoration, the Adamic figure must find, raise, educate, and marry a woman who comes from the fallen lineage of the original human ancestors. As in the Genesis story, where Eve is created from the rib of Adam, the once fallen woman is recreated through the Adamic figure. Through their holy marriage blessing, the woman is restored to the state before the fall of Eve, and together, they could establish a new, God-centered lineage, through the creation of the true family. On such foundation, the blessing, given by the Adamic figure, who represents God's authority and grace on this world, could be extended to the rest of humanity. But, the only begotten daughter theology, once again, stands in complete opposition to these core teachings of Reverend Moon. By not only denying the messianic identity and mission of the Adamic figure, but by actually taking it for Mrs. Han herself. Reverend Moon's cousin, Yong-Yeon Moon, was shocked, and Mrs. Han spoke to him about her husband's messianic role, with scorn and contempt. He reveals that she said,
재림주가 무슨 재림주예요? 그게 무슨 재림주예요? 시골에 골목길에 골목대장도 못 되는 게 무슨 재림주예요? 계속 막말해요.
Her words cut deep for people who have followed and respected Reverend Moon. It is hard to believe that Mrs. Han would belittle her husband in such a contemptuous and disdainful way. Mrs. Han's disrespectful comment betrays what people thought was her view of him. Tragically, Unification Church clerics, who teach the OBD theology, continuously emphasize that Mrs. Han is completely united with Reverend Moon. To advance her messianic claim, Mrs. Han belittles her husband by stating that he, the Adamic figure, is born with original sin, whereas she was born sinless. And that it is by virtue of Mrs. Han that his original sin was removed. She said,
Reverend Moon became the only begotten son by virtue of her, and his original sin was removed, only because he met and married the only begotten daughter.
And said,
혈통전환. 나는 모태부터야. 여러분들이 이건 믿어야 돼.
Mrs. Han is turning Reverend Moon's teachings on their head, where she is the one that finds and chooses him as her husband, where she is the one who removed Reverend Moon's original sin, and where she is the central person that moves God's providence. In asking people to believe that she was born without original sin, OBD denies the entire premise of principle-based restoration. It denies that the Adamic figure has to find the woman from the fallen world and to recreate her to stand as a historic woman, who restores the failures of Eve in order to establish a God-centered family. This is the most basic and core of concepts of the divine principle. How can her words be reconciled with Reverend Moon's teachings, when Reverend Moon taught that the Messiah, who comes as the perfected Adam, must first find his true bride, who can be loved by God from an absolute standard, and then move on to the position of a true couple? Reverend Moon had made clear his identity and mission on many occasions. For instance, regarding original sin, he said, I have no relation to fallen lineage. Those who think that I was born with fallen lineage don't understand the divine principle. In terms of the Messiah's role and gender, Reverend Moon also said, what is the Messiah? The Messiah is the one who stands in the position of God's direct Son and comes centering on God's love, absolute love, to bring the seed of life. Mrs. Han can never bring the seed of life, because she is not a man, and she is not an Adamic figure. So, who is seducing and misguiding Mrs. Han from behind the scenes to pursue this path, that puts her at odds with her husband, and his principal teachings? The Unification Church clerics, who support the only begotten daughter theology, are fully aware that this new theology diametrically opposes the divine principle and Reverend Moon's teachings. And, although we will delve into this aspect in detail in the next video, it is important to understand that it was, in fact, Unification Church clerics who maliciously lied to members, telling them that Reverend Moon and Mrs. Han were united and completely one, without separation between them. It was the clerics themselves who intentionally misled Mrs. Han to believe and to promote her unprincipled theology for their own selfish gains. These clerics fought relentlessly to cling to a church structure where they used Mrs. Han by setting her up to be the object of worship for their church. They did this, fully knowing that Reverend Moon consistently taught that the Messiah and his family should set an absolute precedent of attending God as his filial children, becoming a living example for humanity. He never taught that he or his couple were to be an object of worship for a church. He also called for the end of the church era in order to launch a global blessing movement of God-centered families. Although the clerics do not want to acknowledge it, given the overwhelming evidence, they have no choice but to admit that OBD theology is completely incompatible with the principle and Reverend Moon's teaching, and that Mrs. Han was not united with Reverend Moon. That is why, today, clerics are forced to take the absurd and heretical position that 95% of what Reverend Moon said was not true, and that the divine principle was meant for a different era. Mrs. Han's claims of being a Messiah do not arise from natural law, the divine principle, nor biblical precedent, but rather from her ignorance. She said,
Until now, all religions have emerged with a male-centric focus. That's why something feels imbalanced. The birth of life is not done by the father, but by the mother. Only 0.001% is the father, and 99.99% is the mother.
Mrs. Han's denying the importance of the father in the conception process not only shows her radical feminist perspective, but also runs against the laws of nature. She ignores the fact that it is the father's sperm, that is, the seed of life and root of identity, that determines the sex of the child, and therefore, determines the child's basic identity. Mrs. Han's claim that the father only contributes 0.001% goes against biological, scientific evidence of subject and object duality, found throughout all of creation. Why is Mrs. Han's new OBD theology so satanic and problematic? It is because it derails God's providence, by denying the messianic mission and the identity of the messianic figure. As mentioned earlier, from a principled perspective, the Adamic figure comes to restore the fall, by establishing the proper relationship between man and woman, centering on God. Furthermore, Reverend Moon explained that the mission of the Messiah does not end there. He must establish an absolute true family advancing to the position of true parents. Then, he can build the heavenly kingdom on earth as well as in heaven, centering on that true family. In other words, part of the Adamic figure's messianic mission entails securing the unity of 3 generations centering on God, which was lost during the fall. In the previous video, we explained that in 1998, in what he called the most significant cosmic event in God's providence, Reverend Moon recognized his son, Dr. Hyun Jin Preston Moon, as an Adamic figure, the 4th Adam, and as his successor to lead the unification movement. In explaining the providential significance of the moment, Reverend Moon said that it marked the first time 3 generations had been established under God. Now, the precedent of conflict within the original family could be restored. To achieve that end, Reverend Moon proclaimed the age of father and son cooperation, whereby the 3rd and 4th Adams would work together to restore those failures and establish what Reverend Moon referred to as the 3 kingships. It is on the basis of the resolution of these historical failures, that the Adamic figure could establish a new civilization, that is the foundation for God's substantial kingdom of heaven on earth, beyond all religious and sectarian divides in humanity. This is the reason the unification movement has always been characterized as a charismatic, messianic, providential movement. It is because God's providence moves and is led through the Adamic figure and his family, the true family, not an organization or any institution, including an organized church. Indeed, Reverend Moon taught that he did not intend to create any church, and that his mission was the creation of an ideal family. Reverend Moon and Dr. Moon are the Adamic figures, who lead God's providence forward, not organizations such as the Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity or Family Federation for World Peace and Unification, which are mere vehicles to support the Adamic figure's providential work. Simply put, today, Dr. Moon, as an Adamic figure, is the one who leads the unification movement. Yet the only begotten daughter theology does away with the Adamic figure and the true family. OBD maintains and operates the unification church whose object of worship is not God, but the OBD herself. And in her blind denial of the Adamic figure, in her denial of his identity and mission, Mrs. Han is not only denying her husband, but also impeding the work of the current Adamic figure, her own son, Dr. Moon. Rather than supporting him, who advances God's work through numerous providential activities, she chose a path competing against him by claiming that she succeeded Reverend Moon, sowing the seeds of confusion and furthering the schism within the unification movement. The OBD theology stands fundamentally at odds with God's providence and the divine principle as well as Reverend Moon's teaching. As Mrs. Han is attempting to reverse dominion over Reverend Moon, the Unification Church leadership is maliciously and conveniently claiming that she is one with him to keep the Unificationists blindly obedient to their satanic agenda. Her denial of Reverend Moon as an Adamic figure reveals how she came to think of him. It shows that she does not accept his messianic status. Many movement members are disillusioned because they are learning that the only begotten daughter theology is in direct conflict with divine principle and Adamic authority. OBD is a wholesale rejection of everything Reverend Moon, Dr. Moon, and God stand for. There is no question that the OBD cult is the greatest impediment to God's providence today, tarnishing the legacy and memory of Reverend Moon, and destroying his family, as well as leading the unification movement members and families down the path of destruction. As such, this new unprincipled OBD cult cannot but face heaven's judgment. And, as the Unification Church continues to advocate the OBD agenda, it will be swept further and further into the dustbin of history. Our responsibility in this age is to understand the principle and unite with the providential central figure, the Adamic authority that carries forward God's providence. In the next video, we will see the central role played by Unification Church clerics in the destruction of Reverend Moon's marriage, his family, and God's providence.